Okay, so
wife,
Well, she doesn't look like she's sleeping in the car with the kids. The white car right up front.
all right, we'll go check.
all right, let's get started. Okay, so we're going to begin in Mark chapter 7, starting in verse 31. And we're in the midst of this is kind of how this goes within Mark. We see a few miracles, we see some teaching, and remember at the beginning of chapter 7, we see some discussions between Jesus and the Pharisees and some frustration between the Jesus and the Pharisees. And then we come back to a couple of miracles. And now in verse 31, we come to the next of the miracles, and it says, so then he returned from the region of Tyre. If you'll recall, last on Sunday, we had that they had gone to the region of Tyre and Sidon, and he had run across a Gentile woman and whose son was possessed by a demon. And she asked for Jesus to heal him, and he kind of says, well, why would it be right for me to give the food for her daughter, to give the food that was meant for the children to the dogs under the table? And she goes, well, I'm not asking for that. I just want some, the dogs aren't restricted from having the crumbs. And so he heals her daughter. Now we come to this moment and we see, then he returned from that region. So there's some directionality to this, and went through Sidon back to the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. Okay. And they brought to him a man who was deaf and had a speech impediment, and they begged him to lay his hands on them. Okay. Oh, sorry. Mark 7.
Yeah, I'm sitting there. Mine doesn't match up with him. In the wrong book. I hate when I do that.
So, and begs him to lay his hands on him. So it says, in taking him aside from the crowd privately, and by the way, this is fun, he puts his fingers in his ears, okay, and then spits and touches his tongue. So all we can kind of get the idea is he goes like this, and then he goes and then puts his on his tongue. And looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, Aphatha, that is, be opened. Okay. And his ears were opened, and his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Okay. And Jesus charged them to tell no one, but the more he charged them, the more zealously they proclaimed it.
Yeah, they knew they would.
Yeah, and they were
right.
And they were astonished beyond measure, saying, he has done all things well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. Now, what it seems like is not entirely mute, but there's not really a clear understanding of whether he really had something wrong with his speech, or if his issues with his speech was that he couldn't hear. Because remember that a lot of people who are deaf don't speak very clearly because they can't hear themselves.
They can't hear themselves talk.
So, but either way, not only does he heal him not being able to hear, but he heals him not being able to speak.
Yeah. Which I think even if you'd been deaf your whole life and you spoke a certain way, if you got your hearing back all of a sudden, I think you would still speak that way for at least a while.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you would understand what the words were.
So both of those are very okay. So then as we move to chapter 8, then we come to another miracle, and it's another feeding miracle. Now, I will mention this so that you know this. There are some scholars who try to say that this is just a repeat of the other one.
I don't think so.
There's two issues that run into this. First issue is that the details are different in this story. The second thing is when we get a little bit further down here, Jesus mentions both of them. Jesus is going to have a conversation later in this chapter where he's going to say, don't you remember when I fed the 5,000? And don't you remember when I fed the 4,000? So both of them are mentioned by Jesus. So they are two separate miracles, but it's two feeding miracles. Okay, so in those days, when again a great crowd had gathered, then they had nothing to eat. He called his disciples to him and said to them, I have compassion on the crowd because they have been with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. Now, it doesn't mean they haven't eaten in 3 days, but probably they've stuck with him and now they've run out of food. If I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way. And some of them have come from far away. And his disciples answered him, how can one feed these people with bread here in this desolate place? So where are we supposed to find bread, Jesus?
And once again,
Well, you know, how do they keep doubting him when they've seen it before?
But we do the same thing.
Well, yeah, I just don't listen.
Probably a lot of
Mhm.
it.
So Jesus says, okay, so how many loaves do we have? And they said 7. So they got 2 more loaves of bread this time, but no fish.
but no fish. That's okay.
He directed the crowd to sit down on the ground, and he took the 7 loaves, and having give thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to set before the people. And they set them before the crowd. Oh, and they had a few small fish. So they did have fish. Okay. And having blessed them, he said that these also should be set before them. And they ate and were satisfied. So they ate enough that they were full. And they took up the broken pieces left over. And this time there are 7 baskets full of leftovers.
Yeah. That's
Okay.
a lot.
Of remnants. Large baskets.
That's a lot.
And there were about 4,000 people. It's actually 4,000 men. And he sent them away. Immediately got into the boat with the disciples and went to the district of Dalmanutha. Okay, so for the second time, we have seen a pretty spectacular miracle involving food.
Yeah.
Okay. Then when we come to the next story, this is actually a rather funny discussion here. When we come to the next story, it says the Pharisees came and began to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. So now let's make sure that we, have a moment here and count. Okay. So we have 1, 2, 3 major miracles in the last chapter and the first part of this chapter. Hi, Kathy. How are you? Nope, I understand it happens. So, but yet watch. So do something miraculous so that we can believe you.
Yeah, but were they there when he did the feeding?
They followed him everywhere, it seems
So
like.
they've already seen something miraculous.
So,
They were looking for food.
and the truth of the matter is, so,
Trying to set him.
and remember too, that even if they haven't directly seen it, the stories are going around. So what the issue really is, and this is absolutely the discussion that comes into talking about the Pharisees. Okay. It's part of their rebellion.
Right.
What are you going to do to prove it?
Verse 12, right?
In verse
So-
12.
So do another miracle, Jesus, so that you can
Do it
prove
in
that.
front of me,
Mhm.
yeah.
Okay. Now, we find times that it's very clear the Pharisees don't believe it even when it happens.
Yeah.
Because remember that in the Gospel of John, when he heals the man who was born blind, they're like, oh, you must not have really been blind.
Yeah. Who's to say if you were truly blind?
So this is something that comes up very often within the life of Jesus, and certainly is in each of the Gospels. This demanding of a sign.
Prove
Okay.
yourself.
So remember, this has always been one of those things. Because remember, all the way back, okay, when we look at Moses, okay, when God calls Moses, okay, well, what if they don't believe me?
Yeah, questioning, yeah. Mhm.
Okay, well, sign number 1, and this is literally what we're talking about. Sign number 1, throw your stick down, it becomes a snake. Sign number 2, put your hand inside your cloak. When it comes out and it's covered in disease, put your hand back and bring it back out and it's normal. And third, take a little water and pour it out and it'll become blood. Okay, God gives him 3 signs. We see even Moses a couple times want a sign from God as to what to do. Gideon demands multiple signs before he does what God tells him to do. We see this idea within the children of Israel that it was a very normal thing for them to demand something miraculous to happen so that they could believe that God was talking to them. Okay, but what we're really looking at is not so much the idea of that. We are looking at the fact that Jesus has been doing all these miraculous things and they still refuse to believe it. And so it's really, just one more sign, Jesus. You've almost convinced us. One more sign. Okay, now, this is a little, this discussion here in Mark comes a little earlier in the story, so it's probably one that comes multiple times. Okay, in some of the other gospels, we see this moment later, and Jesus says, instead of just, he sighed deeply in his spirit. So you get this, oh my, okay.
Here we go again.
Why does this generation seek a sign? Now, in Mark, Matthew, and Luke, we see this moment. It says, an evil and adulterous generation demands a sign. Okay, if you have to have a sign, it means that you're not following God. If he's got to give you a sign before you'll believe. Okay, it's a little bit like the joke that I often tell people, that because I've often been asked, do you think God still sometimes speaks audibly? And there are scholars who say, oh no, even in the Bible, when it talks about God speaking audibly to people, no, that's not what happened. That's not really what happened. Clearly it is, because there are a couple of big moments. Certainly in the life of Jesus, there are 2 moments where he says a voice came down from heaven saying, this is my beloved son.
when he's baptized.
And then in John, there's actually a third one.
Really?
Where during the last week of Jesus's life, while he's in Jerusalem, he says, glorify your name. And the voice comes down from heaven and said, I have and will continue. And it says that everybody around thought it had thundered.
Just like when they were on that mountain and God was talking, thought it was thunder.
So it is clear in Scripture that God sometimes speaks audibly. Now, here is the thing. It would be wrong to assume that God doesn't do that anymore. However, even when we look in Scripture at moments where God speaks audibly, the way I always look at it is, if you have God yell down from heaven to tell you to do something, then you probably missed a memo somewhere.
Yeah, probably a lot of memos.
That God has been trying to talk to you before then. And remember too, that there is a place in the Bible where it speaks about the idea that God is not always speaking in the really dramatic things. So in the story of, and I'm almost positive it's Elijah, he says, go in this cave and then I'll talk to you. And it says, first there's this huge fire, and then there's this huge storm, and then there's this huge wind. And then it says there's this little bitty whisper, and then Elijah goes, oh, that's God, and comes out. Okay. Sometimes the way God speaks to us is in a small voice, is in a quiet voice. When we're finally quiet with God and we're listening, we have to strain our ears. Okay. But that is a mark of intimacy. The quiet talking together. the quiet discussion that is just for the two of you. Okay. And so I think that's important. But notice the idea is, and the discussion in the other two gospels where they demand a sign, he says, I say to you, no sign will be given to you except for the sign of Jonah. Okay. Which, by the way, is one of those things that I will be fair when I say this, is the reason that I believe the story of Jonah is real and not just a parable. Because Jesus goes, you'll get the same sign Jonah got. Well, what was the sign Jonah got?
Got swallowed by a fish.
He got swallowed by a fish.
That would be I don't want that kind of sign.
Okay. But that's not exactly how Jesus is dealing with this.
Okay.
The sign of Jonah is, and it's interesting that it works this way. It's the sign of Jonah to the Assyrians. I got swallowed by a fish. I spent 3 days in the belly of the fish, and now I'm here. So the sign of Jonah is that just like Jonah spent 3 days in the belly of a fish and then was released from the belly of the fish, Jesus died, spent 3 days in the belly of the earth, and then rose to new life.
Oh, that makes sense.
So that's the sign of Jonah.
Got you.
Now, the sign Jonah got for his disobedience is he got swallowed by a fish. But what Jesus is saying is, my death and resurrection is enough sign for any of you.
Mhm.
Okay. And we have the same thing go on in our world today. You will have people that we talk to them about Jesus and they go, well, prove that God is real. Well, that's demanding a sign.
Mhm. I'm living proof God's real.
Mhm. I watched a video of a guy who's defending the gospel, and this lady, I want 100% proof. Oh, really? You live your life that way? So you don't go get food from the grocery store? You don't 100% know there's no pesticides on that apple?
Yeah.
You
Just go on faith.
don't take any medicine because you can't be 100% sure that that medicine's not going to have a terrible side effect and kill you. We don't live our life with 100% proof.
No. It's exhausting trying to. Too.
Uh-huh. Well, so why do you expect 100% proof for God? If you can't live any other area of your life that way, then why do you think that's what you have to have for God?
Anyone could deny it with the seasons as they are.
I agree. But understand, but this comes back to the whole discussion of what we're really talking about. Unbelief in God is not actually unbelief, it's rebellion. Okay. Now there are those who have never heard, or God is calling, they have not accepted yet, they have not turned to him yet. But those that will say, well, I just don't believe and you can't prove, it's not really unbelief, it's rebellion. And I'll give you the answer. It's one of those funny things, and they brought it up in one of these movies a while back. Why are you angry at something that doesn't exist? Because how many of the people that will claim that they don't believe in God, they have animosity towards anyone who does. Well, that means they have animosity towards God. Why would you be angry with something that doesn't exist? I don't get angry when somebody says, oh, I believe in unicorns.
It's so interesting.
But it's not unbelief, it's rebellion. They are angry with God, so they choose out of spite to say, I don't believe in him. And if you believe in him, then you're weak, you're
Delusional.
you're stupid, you're
Drinking the Kool-Aid.
uh-huh.
I done drunk the Kool-Aid.
The truth of the matter is, and remember, this is the other half of that. You can only be an atheist till you die. There are no atheists, there are no dead atheists.
No, they're just burning in hell.
because it says that when you die,
You will know.
Yep.
it says every knee will bow.
Every name.
So once you have finished this life of denying God's existence, you will meet him.
I heard a phrase the other day that I don't believe in God, but I do believe in hell. And I thought, if you don't believe in God, there is no hell.
Yeah,
I know so many people that don't believe in hell or heaven.
Mhm.
I know people that call themselves
I think a
Christian
lot
who
of
don't
times
think
when
that
they
there's
say
a
that,
hell.
they're
My
actually
sister
afraid,
would.
but they don't know how to face it and deal
I
with
think
it.
they're smarter. They think they're smarter than the word.
Well, but but understand, and there are so many elements to this when we look at the rebellion of mankind. Okay. Because one of the major discussions that they won't tell you this, and I don't know that they even recognize it, but one of the major elements of going through the idea of evolution is that if you believe in evolution, then maybe the monkey you came from didn't sin. See, the concept of sin.
Wait, that don't make sense.
So where does the concept of original sin come from?
The garden.
Right. There were two people.
Yes.
There were only
And
two
a snake
people.
and a bunch of animals.
Uh-huh. And those two people sinned against God and they passed on sin to everyone else.
Yeah. I
Well,
believe
if
that.
you deny that that's true, then maybe the group of people you came from, because it didn't just start with two, it was, whatever.
Yeah.
Maybe you're not involved in that. It is an attempt to remove.
circumvent the original sin.
It's an attempt to remove an overarching authority that has authority to say what you're doing isn't right. Okay. And the Bible tells us that there are two things they will attack always. Okay. They will attack the creation and they will attack the flood.
But it is shown in cultures all
Yes.
over, not just, all over the world. There's cultures that talk about a giant flood.
Well,
It's
you
not
see
just
too many
central.
times the flood.
Yeah.
We look at
Yep.
rock formation.
Yeah.
But in Peter, it makes a comment about the fact that that they will say that no, things have always just kept going just like they are, and there was no flood, and there was no beginning. Well, what's the point of that? Well, if there's no creation and there's no flood, then the Bible's not true.
Yeah.
We don't exist.
But I can see back then when they didn't have all the science and all that. We have the science, and every time they try to disprove the Bible, they wind up proving it.
Well,
So you would think people would wake up.
but it's a matter of a word called paradigm. Okay. Paradigm is the way you look at things. Okay. Paradigm, I think is right. Okay. Your paradigm is the eyes through which you look. Okay. So a person who is an evolutionist begins with, well, there's no God. It was all by natural processes.
Yeah.
So then when they look at something, they try to figure out how it can fit into no God and all by natural processes.
Yeah.
Well, if you start there, then you're going to shoehorn every bit of information that you get into that idea. Okay. If you come at it from a paradigm that says, I believe there is a God and I believe he created, then the exact same evidence that they use to disprove creation will prove creation. Okay. So look at it this way, and we'll deal with this for just a moment. I know we're chasing a rabbit, but this is kind of an important. So one of the big things that scientists will come into is the idea of that there's all these layers of geological time and then skeletons of very simple beings, and then it moves up a little bit and it's a little more complicated and okay. And this proves that over millions of years evolution occurred and all of that. Okay. It's also exactly what you would expect to happen if the entire earth is covered by water for a year.
Yeah.
That the very simple animals would die first and they would be buried in the lowest layer, because what happens when you have a bunch of moving water? It drops sediment.
Yeah.
And then the next layer of animals that are a little more complex can find a place to hide for a little bit, okay, and all the way through. So it's just as much of we can make just as much of a case that the geological layers, quote unquote, are a graveyard of life from the flood
Right.
as we can from
They say it's
the millions of years.
Yeah.
Okay. So you take another one that in recent years, science has changed their idea, is there was, whenever I was in school, there was this really wonderful discussion about how the Colorado River over millions of years cut the Grand Canyon.
I don't believe that.
Okay. Well, there's a major problem with that. Okay. The largest river in the world is the Nile,
Mhm.
and it is going through sand. And if you go and look at throughout the Nile, there are places where it's cut deep canyons. Not as deep as the Grand Canyon, but deep canyons. It has a delta so big, has all this delta system where it's deposited dirt. Okay. You go to the Colorado River and there's none of that, or very little of that. There's some delta, but nothing like the Nile. Okay. Well, if you cut out of rock and sandstone the largest trench in the world, that dirt has to go somewhere. And so if the Colorado River over millions of years had cut the Grand Canyon, then the Colorado River would have this massive delta system at the
With
end
all
of
the
the
runoff.
right. In fact, if you go and look at satellite pictures of the Mediterranean, the eastern side of the Mediterranean is brown because of all the dirt that the Nile churns out in there.
Yeah.
You can actually see a plume going out into the Mediterranean Sea of the dirt that is coming out of the Nile River as it runs.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, and I think it's the same way with Mississippi. So why isn't it at the Colorado Grand Canyons?
So when we look at that, so now the new theory is that in north of Colorado or north of Arizona, in where Colorado and Utah and Montana and all that, there was this super lake, this huge, massive lake, and it burst and it ran down the Colorado and it cut the Grand Canyon. And so notice, watch how this works. The new theory is that the Colorado was cut by a catastrophic event.
Flood.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking, the flood.
Okay. So then you come into, well, where did all the water come from?
Out of the ground, God said
Well,
that.
but what I mean though is you have this massive super lake. Where'd that water come from? Well, it came from the aftermath of the flood. They talk about the fact that they had a major dam rupture, or at a major dam scare at one of the big dams built in bedrock. And it was getting near the point where it was going to overflow and break the dam. And so they opened the spillway to let water out. And the spillway ran for I think about half a month. I don't remember the exact number of days. Well, about day 5 or day 6, the water running out stopped being clear and became red.
Because the dirt.
Well, it had channeled itself through about 15 feet of concrete into the clay underneath the concrete. See, when water flows fast, okay, water has bubbles in it.
Uh-huh.
And when water is moving very fast, because water cannot compress at all, then the bubbles become like hammers.
Oh, that makes sense.
It's also the reason why if you jump off a bridge, you want to hit a rock. If you hit the water, you're going to do more damage than if you hit a rock
Like hitting concrete.
because it doesn't compress.
Yeah, that much I know.
It has no give at all. It's
That's why if
absolutely
you kill
solid.
yourself off a bridge, you want to go
How
flat.
high up to drown?
Well, it's the reason that you see,
Golden Gate.
cliff divers, they go in with as little space as possible because you can pierce into it. But if you hit it flat, it doesn't give at all.
Yeah, you gotta go down at a point with your feet or something. That's why
Like
if you're
a
gonna
penny.
kill yourself, you wanna go flat, not.
That's what I'm saying.
Same thing same thing with World War II when they went in and they were trying to blow up dams. They would build a bomb that would blow up underwater
Mhm.
because the water doesn't compress at all, and so it.
Shoots all the water out. Oh, with the
When I
percussion. Well,
yeah,
that's
it's
kind of a
direct.
neat. I'd like to see one blow up on the water.
Sorry. Okay, enough of the rabbit. Sorry, I apologize. But anyway, the idea here is when we talk about demanding a sign, what we're really doing is we're looking for a reason not to believe. See, if you can't do a sign, I'm not going to believe. Well, you're looking for a reason not to believe. So now so it says he left them. So he tells them this, then he leaves, they get back in the boat and they went to the other side. Okay. So he's done a lot of boating recently.
Yeah.
Okay. So they had forgotten to bring bread.
Again,
And this is just the disciples. So they had forgotten to bring bread. They only had one loaf with them in the boat. So they had 13 people and one loaf of bread. And so he cautions them. He says, watch out. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. Okay, so he gives them this statement. Watch out. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. They begin discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. So they go, is he saying this because we forgot the bread? So what is he really saying here? What he's saying is he is comparing their attitude. He is comparing the way they think to leaven. Okay, so the reason he's doing that is, what does leaven do?
Makes
it
it grow.
grows.
Okay, it spreads. So if I take a huge bowl of dough and I sprinkle in 3 grains of leaven and I leave it long enough, how much is going to be leavened? All of it.
Yeah. It contaminates it.
It will contaminate everything. Okay. In fact, you talk about, I forget what it's called, love bread or whatever it was that they used to do, that they'd make
Around
they'd
everybody.
they'd make leavened bread and they would take just a little bit of it and save it and give it to somebody else, and then they would make bread with it. And
Yeah.
the same thing with wine, by the
What?
way. When you talk, well, almost any alcoholic, there's enough yeast left in the barrels that they just pour more grape juice in.
Nice.
That you can just once it's leavened, you leave just enough in there so that it has some yeast, and then you start
So
another
if
batch.
you get a used
Is it
wine
the
barrel,
red
you can make
starter?
your own wine.
Yeah, don't do that.
Sorry, I was just
It would probably turn to vinegar.
I was gonna say it will turn to vinegar when you don't do it.
Don't you add sugar?
No, it's air. It's the presence of air.
I'll see. I don't know what I'm doing. This is why I don't. There's a good reason. I'm a drunk.
Yeah. Anyway, so he's talking about don't be contaminated by their beliefs and their system.
Yeah.
Okay. Remember that a couple chapters ago we saw Herod kill John the Baptist.
Yep.
And we've seen the Pharisees go against everything Jesus is talking about because he's not doing it their way. So he's saying, don't be careful of their attitude. Oh, they go, oh, is he mad that we didn't bring bread? And he says, why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts still hard? Having eyes, did you not see? And having ears, did you not hear? And don't you remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? 12. And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? And they said to him, 7. And he goes, well, don't you understand yet? I could feed you with the 1 loaf.
Yeah.
We're not,
And have
we
plenty of extra.
don't need to worry about bread.
We're not going to starve.
So at this moment, they are still,
Not understanding.
they're not focused. Okay. And I think that very discussion of what we see in the life of of the disciples leads us to this next miracle. Okay. And I believe that because of how this kind of flows. So we see this moment where he says something to them and they're confused. Okay. And then it says, and they came to Bethsaida. And some people brought him a blind man and begged him to touch him. And he looked at the blind, they took the blind man by the hand and he led him out of the village. And when he had spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, so spits on his face.
He likes that spitting, huh?
Yeah, he really does.
I don't know. And laid his hands on him. He asked him, do you see anything? And he looked and said, I see people, but they look like trees walking. Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And he sent him to his home, saying, do not even enter the village. Now, wait a minute. Jesus is doing a miracle and it doesn't fully heal him the first time?
He's probably doing that so the guy will understand.
Well,
Becoming more of a believer.
Yeah, there's a purpose
here's
behind
my
that.
opinion.
He's tired.
No? The story right before. The disciples are beginning to see that Jesus is someone special, but they're still confused. That is who this guy is after the first touch. Jesus touches him the first time and he can see, but he can't see clearly yet. And then Jesus touches him a second time and he's fully healed. Well, the very next story is, and Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way, he asked his disciples, well, who do people say that I am? Okay. And they told him, well, John the Baptist, Elijah, one of the prophets. And he asked them, well, then who do you say I am? Peter answered him and said, you're the Christ. Finally sees clearly who he is. So watch. And by the way, this goes on because they're still not completely seeing. And I think it works in both sides. The first time Jesus touches this man, he says, well, I see people. He knows that they're people, but they just look like trees walking. I can't recognize who they really are. I can't recognize them. And so he touches him again, and now his eyes are open and he sees and recognizes. And then the very next story is Peter recognizing, the disciples recognizing he's Christ. Okay. But at the same time, and by the way, in 3 of the Gospels, these 2 stories go, the Peter confessing and the next story go together. Okay. And so I want to make sure we get through both of them because it is absolute. They are absolutely together in all 3 of the synoptic Gospels. Okay. So who do you say I am? You're the Christ, the Son of the living God. Okay. And then it says, and he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he said this plainly. Now, this is the first time that Jesus has plainly said that he's going to die.
Yeah, no parable, no nothing, just this is the facts.
This is absolutely the first time this has happened.
But it doesn't register with them.
Well, more than that. Peter takes him aside and began to rebuke him. So Peter goes, Jesus, can we talk for a minute? And pulls him aside and goes, you can't die. That's not possible. No, no, no. But turning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, get behind me, Satan. For you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. So understand and remember that in one of the other gospels, in Matthew, in fact, at the end of the first story where it says, but who do you say I am? You're the Christ. And he says, well, blessed are you, Peter. You're going to be the rock that founds the church. And in the very next story, get behind me, Satan. Okay. Now, he took the blind man by the hand, led him out of the village, and when he spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, do you see anything? Isn't that what he's asked the disciples there?
Yeah.
Do you see who I am yet?
Do you understand?
Well, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. Okay, that's right. Good. I'm glad that you recognize that. But they still don't really see. They're still seeing trees walking.
Mhm.
They see who Jesus is. They recognize he's the Son of God. They recognize, and remember, it's interesting because it's for however this works in the way that Mark writes it and really in the way the gospel writers write it, it says, I see people. He knows they're people. But they look like trees walking. They're not clear, but he can recognize that they're people. Even though he'd never seen people before. So they recognize he's the Son of God, but they don't recognize what he's come to do.
Yeah.
And in the very next story, and so the rest of each of the gospels, each of the synoptic gospels, and this is an important element to this story and to the way this works, is that the first half of each of the synoptic gospels, when we talk about Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are Jesus trying to help them understand he's the Son of God. And then just about halfway into each of those, they get it finally. And as soon as they get it, he begins to talk about dying, and then they don't get it.
I got a question.
Yeah.
Why are they called synaptic gospels?
Okay.
What is that word?
Sorry. Synoptic means, optic means eyes.
Uh-huh.
Okay. And when you think of a synonym, what does that mean? If you have two words that are a synonym,
I don't even know what a synonym
okay,
is.
they mean the same
Oh,
thing.
right. Okay. Okay.
Okay. Or they sound,
Okay.
no, they mean the same thing.
Similar.
Yeah. So a synoptic gospel means the same eyes.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke share kind of a similar viewpoint into the life of Jesus. They're not exactly the same, but it's clear that they use information from each other.
Yes.
They tell a lot of the same stories, and they kind of give the same picture of Jesus.
Yes.
John is a little different. It still tells the story of Jesus fully, but Matthew and Luke both tell the birth story from a little different angle, but they both tell the birth story. All of them tell about, there are things all of them tell about the baptism, and then a lot of the miracles are the same between the three gospels. And Luke and Matthew share what looks like a very similar discussion in the Sermon on the Mount. It's not exactly the same, but it's similar.
Yeah.
And so that is a major element within the study of the Gospels, is how are they the same and how are they different? And why are they the same in places and different in other places? Mark was written first, and then Matthew used Mark, and then Luke used Matthew as one of his sources. And they have entire books that deal with simply how each of the Gospels tells the same story.
Gotcha.
Yes.
Do you think that they thought Jesus was a prophet until they finally recognized he was the Son of God?
Well, probably was part of it. Notice, and this comes back to the story. We're not sure exactly what they thought, but notice, who do people say I am? Well, John the Baptist, maybe Elijah, one of the prophets. So, remember, Herod thought he was John the Baptist had raised from the dead. Elijah would have been a discussion of the forerunner, which is what John the Baptist was. But maybe maybe they thought maybe Jesus was the forerunner to the Messiah. Now they thought John the Baptist was all these things too. Or one of the prophets. They know there's something different about him. But remember that before John the Baptist, we don't have any biblically written prophetic word
They hadn't
for
read
like
the book.
400 years.
The book, because there wasn't one yet.
So we're sitting here looking at this deal, and none of them had seen a prophet or a true prophet of God. And understand that when we talk about this idea of prophet, Jesus was a prophet, but he was much more than that. So they're recognizing elements of who he is, but they're not picking up on all that he is. Well, they finally come, well, who do you say that I am? They probably thought he was an itinerant rabbi for a while. He's just a really cool teacher. But he's doing all these miracles. He's doing all these incredible things. And they're like, wow, this is impressive. And finally, well, who do you think I am? Well, you're the Son of God. But clearly later, they don't get it. This was a moment of clarity for them, but later they still miss it. But I think it's important to understand that what we see is, and one of the big things we see here in 27 through 33 is we see exactly where the disciples are at this point. They finally figured out who Jesus is, but they're still really troubled by what the plan is. Well, in the same way, this blind man that he heals here, he touches him the first time and the guy gets a bit of it. But it's not till that second touch comes that he sees clearly. Well,
Yeah.
what is the story for the rest of the gospel? Right now, the disciples see in part. And they kind of get it. But it's not till after the resurrection and really till the coming of the Holy Spirit that they really get it. So I think the reason this story gives this kind of dual phase healing is a picture to us of what God is doing in the lives of the disciples. That he's now brought them to the point they kind of see. And so the rest of the gospel is moving them to the point that they can completely see. And by the way, he does the same thing to us. When we come to salvation, we don't see everything. Now, we are completely healed and restored, but there is a process of us going in Jesus.
I still don't see everything.
We're still learning.
Uh-huh. And so, but that comes back to the idea of that what we're supposed to be doing is following Jesus. It's not nearly as much about what we're doing as that we're following. Because as we follow, he changes us into what he wants us to be in his time and in his way, which is a major element in the discussion of, sometimes we see people that come to Christ and we had a guy in this building that decided to tell one of our very new, baby believers that he shouldn't be in church if he was still doing this. And he came
I'm glad nobody said that stuff to me.
He came to me after church and let me know he had said that. And several people in this church saw me half lose it.
Telling newborn Christians stuff like that. You
Yeah,
encourage them
I'm
to
so
come.
glad nobody ever said that to me. And I gave him plenty of reason to. Like I cussed like a sailor for quite a few years.
But my thing is, and this has always been a major thing that I think is important to say. We are not anyone's Holy Spirit.
Nope.
Now I do want to say there are times that the Holy Spirit will lead us to go and talk to somebody. I'm not saying that, but we are nobody's Holy Spirit. And God will work on the garbage in people's life in his time and in his way.
And he
Now,
does.
if we are living, if we have a member of our church who's living in rebellion, then it is our job to go, hey, hold on, let's talk about this. But we tend to, and you've heard me say this before, we tend to look at the sins in our life and think they're minor, and the sins in everybody else's life and say they're major. Well, Jesus has a very, very graphic way of explaining that. And he says, why are you trying to take a splinter out of your brother's eye when you have a log hanging out of yours?
Mhm.
Jesus has some comedy moments, and that's definitely one of them. Because you see this picture of this guy with a pair of tweezers, and there's this little splinter in his brother's eye, and at the same time, he's trying to turn his head a little so he doesn't hit him with the log.
Yeah.
But there are times we're called to work for the Holy Spirit to help someone change, but at the same time, we have to make sure that we're willing to let God work in his time and in his way. None of us grow at the same speed, but we look at this picture and we see the disciples in this place where they finally recognize who Jesus is. And when Jesus tells him why he's come, they're like, oh, wait a minute here.
This can't be possible.
All right, we're going to stop right there because we are out of time.
What, 34?
34. We'll start in 34. And we will see this twice on Sunday. I'm sorry for that. Or, well, it'd be about a different gospel, but this is where we are Sunday too. So,
Nice.
but
As far as I know, I can go to the post office and do that tomorrow.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. You don't have to.